As such, we can see on a historical basis that Muslims were generally tolerant of other religions, that Muslims did display this kind of tolerance for different faiths. Of course, things were not all perfect, and indeed, there have been historical instances of persecution, of inquisitions, of schisms, of religious conflict. And it would be problematic to take a rose tinted view of the treatment of religious minorities in Islamic lands. Persecution did occur, yet in many cases, religious minorities, especially in the case of Christians and Jews, were granted at least a degree of religious freedom. And they did have their own kinds of courts. In the Ottoman period, you had the millet system. And C.H. Becker, an Orientalist who by no means held Islam in favorable terms, writes in his book Islam and Christianity that the theory, however, that the Mohammedan conquerors and their successors were inspired by fanatical hatred of Christianity is a fiction invented by Christians. Whilst, of course, Muslims are not necessarily the good guys, and you can understand that Christians may think that Islam perhaps isn't conducive to free speech or free dialogue. And you can understand perhaps where they're coming from. Reality is far more nuanced. And it's not so simple as, the Quran is against free speech, or the Quran censors speech, or the Prophet Muhammad wanted to censor people who didn't agree with him. Of course, you can understand that people may think that organized religion or certain religious teachings, certain religious scriptures go against that. You can understand that side of the argument. But this is simply to put forward this perspective and show the nuanced nature of this discussion. For more information on this topic, you can consult books such as The Freedom of Opinion in Islam or Top 15 Tough Questions on Islam written by Ahmed Lotfi Rashid. Thus, as per the principles laid out by the Quran, free speech is a necessary aspect of any society. This kind of dialogue facilitated by two opposing sides of an argument is necessary as, first and foremost, it prevents intellectual, social, and political stagnation. Secondly, it allows us to review ideas and change our views on them as part of a process of rationalization. But third and more importantly, it prevents the shackles of tyranny binding a society into insanity. This dialogue and ability to express and develop new views and ideas is especially important in religion, as it allows us to rethink our previous understandings and evaluate whether they may be the best understanding or not. It may often be the case that latter ideas, or novel ideas, or uncommon ideas, or ideas which have laid dormant and non-existent for a long time, but have been revived by an intellectual. It may be that such ideas in fact are more rational or make more sense than mainstream more established ideas. In fact, there's an important statement of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, which is rather profound in its implications, that may God brighten the face of a person who hears a tradition from us and he memorizes it until he can convey it to others. And this is the important point. Perhaps he will convey it to one who understands better than him, and perhaps one who conveys knowledge does not understand it himself. This has a very important implication that indeed it may be the case that later generations build upon the knowledge of their predecessors, and in fact may understand certain concepts better than their predecessors, even if they were the ones who originally founded it. For example, regarding scripture, regarding divine teaching, regarding a prophetic teaching, if someone who is being taught it can understand it better than the one who is teaching it to him, if it was coming directly, if he narrated it directly from the Prophet himself, then what is that to stop, let's say, other forms of knowledge or other forms of religious knowledge, in fact? And so what you can see here is that this is in no way disrespectful towards those predecessors, as it is out of respect for those giants who granted us the foundations upon which we stand, and it is our duty and their right upon us that we further expand upon what we discuss and polish what they wrote down in their books and refine the concepts that they may have introduced. And so developing upon the traditions and knowledge of our ancestors is in fact part of the point of the tradition to begin with. We are simply building upon the base which they left us with. Dr. Yasir Qadi, in his Library Chat 8 video, still available on YouTube, mentions that this development and building upon of knowledge from generation to generation applies not only to science and mathematics but also to theology. There is a famous statement from certain scholars that the way of the Salaf, the pious predecessors within Islamic terminology, is safer, whilst the way of the Khalaf, the later generations of Muslims, is more knowledgeable or more wiser. Although many traditionalist scholars have critiqued this statement, the reality of this statement is that despite the fact that the way of the pious predecessors may have been simpler and more pure, let's say, or more closer to the original spirit of Islamic belief as taught by the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and one notes rather interestingly the simplicity in the fundamental beliefs the Prophet mentioned as the basis of the Islamic faith. The reality is that the generations that came after them, right, the Khalaf, they came after a long tradition of scholarly, of rigorous debate and dialogue, with opposing theological sides engaging in nuanced and complex discussions, both sides presenting their various proofs, both rational, philosophical, and scriptural. Had to sift through the various proofs presented by the respective sides, separating between those proofs which were strong and those which were not so, and coming to a scholarly conclusion about the truth of the matter. Of course, unfortunately, many fell into dogmatism and sectarianism, yet there have always been those amongst these scholars who maintained an academic approach when engaging in these issues. And hence, would have naturally had their biases, they would have naturally had their sectarian biases or their own personal biases. They helped to develop this tradition. They helped to develop upon this knowledge that was given to them by their ancestors or by their forefathers or by previous scholars. They developed and expanded upon it and contributed to the development of this tradition. Indeed, unfortunately, sectarianism and dogmatism are plights that have afflicted the Muslim nation, the Muslim world. Although not only and exclusively just the property of the Muslims. I mean, once upon a time, Christians had a very similar issue. Although, quite fortunately for them, they have moved past, sort of just attacking each other for sectarian issues. It seems that the followers of Christ at one point did engage in this. We thus see historically the brutal persecution of Catholics by Protestants, of Protestants by Catholics, especially during and after the Protestant Reformation. Wars of religion during the 1600s plunged Europe into chaos along sectarian lines. This is despite, quite ironically, the fact that the Bible had declared, "For you are all one in Jesus Christ." So for Christians, they were supposed to be one brotherhood, but they engaged in persecution and inquisitions of one another regardless. And this is quite sad, but tragically quite similar to what the Muslims are going through, where despite the Quran having declared that hold on to the rope of God and do not divide yourselves into sects, Muslims have engaged in this kind of sectarianism. Of course, this isn't to say that there aren't, quote unquote, orthodox or correct beliefs, or there aren't, strands of Islam which you can be more attached to or more sympathetic to. But this kind of sectarianism where you attack each other and, you're constantly kind of dehumanizing each other, viewing each other outside of the fold of the religion, or justifying attacking each other, or just in general promoting very toxic and aggressive attitudes towards one another. The Muslim world unfortunately has become stuck in this for quite a long time now. It was only after a long series of intellectual developments within the Western tradition, coupled with the horrors of this religious persecution, which led to the eventual realization in the collective conscience of the West of the importance of liberty in belief, of liberty of conscience, and the need to tolerate various viewpoints. And so you see the kind of original liberal argument very much. The precursors to liberalism were very much based on this logic of tolerance of different Christian sects. Initially, it was very much within the context of we should tolerate different Christian denominations, different Christian sects. Eventually, the likes of John Locke argued for the importance of individual liberty in viewpoint, beliefs, and speech. It was thus why Will Durant stated, "Mutual tolerance is the price of liberty." Point being that the Western conscience shifted to understanding the importance of this kind of mutual tolerance as being the price of liberty, as Will Durant has said. And so, generally speaking, you saw within Western societies the gradual development of understandings of the importance of kind of social tolerance. That you don't agree with the ideas, but you support the right of the people to live in peace and harmony with you and not to be persecuted on the basis of those ideas. I often see a quote, for example, attributed to Voltaire that, even if not necessarily correctly so, that "I detest what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." And this pretty much sums up the kind of liberal or even libertarian attitude, if you want to call it that, to thought and conscience and speech within many Western countries, at least amongst most, if not many, of the Western population today. And of course, the West can be hypocritical in its application of this. The West can at times go against this. Western powers can at times directly contradict this. And unfortunately, states, deep state, powerful institutions, different powerful organizations in general can at times manipulate certain narratives, indoctrinate huge swathes of the population into certain political narratives. That it is important to know that this belief about the importance of liberty of conscience did develop within the Western tradition. And hence, you obviously saw the view of the American founding fathers as expressed by Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, as has already passed. And of course, ironically, Thomas Jefferson himself owned slaves. A lot of the founding fathers were slave owners. And Steven Pinker, in his book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, mentions this, that although founding fathers and many of leaders of America were indeed hypocritical, the kinds of teachings that you find, the kinds of principles that you find within the Declaration of Independence helped sow the seeds, attitudes to be fully realized and to be fully expanded to their logical conclusion. For example, the United States was absolutely hypocritical in maintaining slavery despite being based upon the liberty of man. It eventually abolished it, after a civil war, very much upon the basis and developing on the tradition that all men are created equal and that all men are endowed with the inalienable right of liberty. We also see such religious persecution playing out in the Tudor era of Britain, although this would of course eventually cease. You can see, for example, the Oxford Illustrated History of Britain for this, or other histories of Britain. Within the Muslim world, although unfortunately certain religious teachings have been used to justify some kind of state tyranny or repression of certain forms of thought or speech, it is important to note how Muslims have used religious teachings either to resist state tyranny or to advance certain ideas or certain thoughts, under the belief that if they are right in what they believe in, and if God is on their side, then nothing can truly harm them, or that their reward is with God. And hence, no matter how much they keep on preaching, as long as they are doing it for the sake of God, then it does not matter if the whole world is against them. And so you can see how the seeds for the development of these ideas of individual liberty, of liberty of conscience, of course, as properly operationalized, I am not necessarily talking about liberalism, whether within the Western tradition or in the Islamic tradition. I would make a distinction between liberalism as an ideology which maximizes individual liberty and between individualism in and of itself as properly operationalized within a tradition with natural checks and balances on it. But nevertheless, individual liberty in and of itself, regardless of whatever liberalism says, is an important value that has to be maintained within each tradition. And so, regardless of what liberalism may say, and regardless of the negative connotations that are oftentimes associated with concepts like liberty of conscience, both within the Western tradition and in the Islamic tradition, you can see the importance of this kind of liberty of conscience, liberty of thought, and of resisting state tyranny. To reinforce this important distinction that I'm making here, there's a difference between liberalism insofar as it is an ideology which attempts to maximize individual liberty, which attempts to maximize individual freedom, to attempt to reach this kind of society where humans are truly happy, where we can bring about human happiness and human fulfillment. I would distinguish between that and individualism, insofar as individualism, individual liberties, having checks and balances on state tyranny to prevent state tyranny, is an important aspect of any tradition and any society. And so individualism, individual liberty, is an important value. And I am more sympathetic to the kind of individualist, individual liberty based argument that a society or many societies throughout history have at times subsumed the individual into the collective. And so we should allow for individual expression and for freedom of conscience. But that has to be based within the context of a social tradition, some kind of social responsibility and social duty. You cannot just maximize individual liberty infinitely and expect to reach human happiness. In fact, the opposite is true. A kind of hyper individualized society doesn't breed human happiness. In fact, it breeds the opposite. It breeds loneliness, and it ultimately breeds this kind of nihilism and a lack of social relationships, a lack of kind of community. And I know liberals may retort and say that, we don't believe in breaking down communities, especially the more classical liberal types. But you have to consider that the kind of extension, the logical conclusion of attempting to maximize individual liberty at times does come at the cost of preserving certain social relationships. Because this is the important point. Individual liberty can only be properly operationalized within the context of social relationships, a society, a broader network. And this is the important point. Individual liberty is somebody else's responsibility, right? It's the responsibility of the collective society to remain that individual liberty. There is no meaning to individual liberty if everybody's just off in their own bubbles and nobody, we live in a kind of hyper atomized society. And so individualism, insofar as you have this individual liberty within the context of a tradition, can be properly operationalized. But liberalism fails precisely because it thinks that maximizing individual liberty will bring about human happiness. In reality, if you pick up any self statistics regarding mental health illnesses, anxiety, nihilism within our current society, especially amongst my generation, Gen Z, and arguably our society is the most liberal that has been, you see that in fact, just simply giving people more freedom doesn't necessarily bring about greater happiness. The things that generally speaking we find to bring about human happiness, they tend to be relationships, right? We tend to base ourselves very much around the people we interact with, whether they be family, friends, or loved ones. And similarly, we do have social responsibilities. And so you cannot just keep on maximizing individual liberty as a principle that's simply false. You have to take into consideration other principles. And so, whilst we can absolutely have a society, a tradition which prioritizes individualism, which prioritizes individual liberty, which prioritizes individual conscience and liberty of conscience, and not having the state as a kind of tyrannical force, ultimately there are limits, there are checks and balances on individual liberty, precisely because it cannot be operationalized without being within the context of a tradition, without being based within a kind of social context in the first place. When talking about sectarianism, we can note this kind of fracturing and sectarianism in secular circles as well. For example, we can see the reformist controversy in leftist Labour circles towards the latter half of the 19th century that led to the split between your more democratic socialists or your more democratic leftist types and the kind of revolutionary forces, right? Those who would argue for a more authoritarian communist state, let's say. For example, you can see Dr. Carol Quigley's Tragedy and Hope. And of course, there are more nuances here, there are complexities. I'm just giving this out there as a general point, right? The debate on whether to maintain the revolutionary spirit espoused by Karl Marx in his works, or to take a more gradual reformist approach, can essentially be considered a kind of secular version of a theological debate on how to interpret certain concepts found within scripture. And you can project this onto this kind of secular sense where Karl Marx or Engels, they discuss certain ideas. And then the application of these ideas or revising certain ideas is then a debate amongst later peoples. This is kind of similar to the kind of theological debates you have, but this is in a very secular context. Utopian vision of the future. Now, there is an important point to be made here. Marx and Engels and the subsequent people based within the Marxist tradition, I mean, for example, you could read people like Lenin, make a distinction between utopian socialism and scientific socialism. So for Marxists, they believe or they consider their own kind of framework of socialism to be a scientific framework for socialism. But they consider many of the kind of precursors to socialism to be utopian in their way of thinking. For example, if you look at people like Owens, if you look at people like Saint Simon, right, these people were very much utopian in the outlook. But for Marxists, their framework is scientific. There are criticisms of the claim that Marxism is scientific, of course. Karl Popper famously critiqued this because he said that the predictions of Marxism were unfalsifiable. And of course, scientific predictions, or predictions based upon empirical observations, have to be falsifiable. But for Karl Popper, these predictions were unfalsifiable, hence they couldn't be scientific in the first place. And of course, you may say, or many people will still argue, that despite claiming to be scientific, Marxists may give a kind of vision of the future which is utopian in nature, but they kind of use scientific language to advance this kind of utopian claim. Interesting back and forth that Marxists and non-Marxists will have. But regardless of what you think about this, it's important to note that there's a kind of similarity. There's this kind of, in terms of the imagery that Marxism gives about, predictions of the future, there's an interesting similarity between this kind of Christian messianic vision of God's kingdom being established on earth at the end of days, and the kind of classless society that Marx is predicting, right? This kind of utopian vision. And I know Marxists may disagree with me here, but just it's important and it's interesting to note some of these similarities. And whatever you believe regarding this, that is an interesting conversation to be had. In many ways, we can consider communism as a kind of secular religion. In fact, Gramsci, the famous Italian communist, he does mention this point that Marxism, or communism more specifically, can be seen as this kind of secular religion. And of course, I don't mean to get too much into the whole communism versus capitalism debate. However, it is important to note that whilst many of Marx's critiques of capitalism are absolutely valid, and I think most people would agree with the critiques that Marx presents about capitalism, I do think that many people, even on the left, would disagree with the alternative or the kind of solutions that many Marxists present. And unfortunately for the left, many of the socialist projects or many of the communist projects haven't exactly been successful, or even if they have been successful in certain periods, or they have worked out for a while, unfortunately it seems that the capitalist states or the liberal capitalist democracies have been able to survive great periods of turmoil, but many of the great communist nations that once existed are no longer. For example, the USSR ultimately has collapsed. Most communist nations, in fact, do employ somewhat of a more kind of mixed economy, do incorporate elements of capitalism into their economy. And it's interesting to note, for example, in the context of China, many will debate whether China is a kind of socialist state or whether it's an authoritarian capitalist or state capitalist nation. And even other nations such as Vietnam, they've transferred into this kind of market socialism. Now, I read recently this work, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics by Roland Boer, and he mentions in that kind of opening up that China did was due to their own understanding of what socialism was. Socialism is not the final end state to be reached, but rather it is a kind of process. It is a state through which communism or a classless society shall be achieved. Hence, for the Chinese, within the Chinese Marxist framework more specifically, they believe that the contradictions, are part of the process which is driving us towards this kind of classless society. And so just based on that alone, this actual opening up is part of socialism. This opening up to free markets is part of the process of socialism that will bring about this kind of classless society for them. And of course, you can disagree with that. You can argue about that. You can argue with that framing. But it is important to note what the Chinese perspective currently is, that socialism isn't the final state, but rather it's a process that is bringing us towards this classless society that Marxists may predict. And hence, opening up to, let's say, free markets, which the Chinese have done, is in fact part of this process. Because you have to understand, within the Marxist framework, they talk about contradictions, right? They talk about these contradictions within the capitalist system are bringing about its demise. And so for the Chinese, the socialist system, right, maintains these contradictions, or it can use these contradictions between having a kind of supposedly socialist economy and still having free markets, because socialism is about being a process which will bring about a classless society. And so that can actually be incorporated within the framework of socialism. Whether you agree with that or not, I'm simply presenting what the Chinese Marxist perspective is on that. And if you want more details, you can refer to the work I've just referenced. But regardless, kind of modern capitalist system has clearly dominated and encompassed the whole world within it. At the same time, we can't say that this kind of unregulated, globalized capitalism that is now prevalent is merely a force for good. Although in absolute terms it has raised the level of wealth across the globe, it may still perpetuate much misery, unhappiness, and oppression. And again, despite overall, in absolute terms, wealth having gone up across the globe, in relative terms, most people still remain quite poor. Many people, in fact, remain quite poor. And what often happens is that people focus on the prosperity of a few nations, especially the Western capitalist nations, but they will ignore how other nations across the world are kept in these cycles of debt, in these cycles of suffering, in these cycles of economic backwardness because of the fact that they are attached to the system. And it ignores all of the different tactics and all of the different games that are played by various powerful institutions to ensure that these countries don't become fully developed. And this isn't to say that all capitalists or all of those within a capitalist system have bad intentions. And of course, there are complexities and nuances here that have to be mentioned. If we just gave all of our wealth to, let's say, these poorer nations, it wouldn't necessarily mean that they would automatically become richer overnight. But there is a valid point that there are certain structural inequalities, there are certain structural issues which act as a barrier to less developed nations developing themselves more. Of course, capitalism has brought about many important innovations, important breakthroughs, and the value of free markets, it certainly has its place. But we do have to acknowledge the strengths and weaknesses of things both such as Marxism or socialism and of this kind of free market capitalist economy. Simply creating a freer market, as libertarians may posit, will not necessarily solve these various problems. Neither will allowing the state to completely control the economy, thereby restricting the free market to an unnecessary extent, simply solve issues relating to the suffering of the lower classes. And it's interesting to note that Ibn Khaldun, for example, a medieval famous Islamic historian, he mentions that when the state sort of gets involved in the market, when the state gets involved in trade, it ultimately leads to, people's livelihoods being reduced. It leads to, the state having unnecessary monopolies over the market, and this can be a barrier to genuine trade, to smaller businesses, for example. Yet at the same time, he does also mention that taxes, that these kinds of regulations are necessary as well within the context of a society. And hence, simply making markets as free as possible will not work, but neither will just reducing the market to being a state controlled thing work. In reality, both, the kind of socialist arguments and the libertarian arguments have their strengths and weaknesses, and we need to evaluate both of them based on their merits. Simply resorting to these kinds of theoretical principles will not solve the issues that we face. Such a statement may seem obvious, yet unfortunately people are very entrenched in quite polarized worldviews, quite polarized economic and political models, due to the fact that they are born and bred within the context of these political and economic divides. And it's interesting to know that if one were to ask why in the past people were so obsessed, so fanatically obsessed rather, with certain religious and sectarian issues, I think the very simple question to ask is, well, why are people nowadays so fanatic about certain political ideologies? Why would they wage wars over these things? Why has the 20th century been a century of secular humanist ideologies fighting for dominance over the globe? The answer is very simple, because they are based within the context of these ideologies. They are based within the context of these conflicts. And whilst these conflicts at a certain point may be arbitrary, beyond that certain point they are very real, because they've engulfed the lives of millions of people. If we can understand that people in modernity are radically and perhaps even irrationally embedded in support of political ideologies due to the context and environment in which they exist. We can understand the same for those in past eras, but in the context of sectarian and theological factions. And thus, like I've mentioned, we can appreciate both the good aspects and the bad aspects of things like Marxism, capitalism, socialism, libertarianism, etc., etc. And we can appreciate the good things and the bad things about them. But what's even more important than that is to humanize and contextualize the people who are based within these conflicts, not necessarily to justify what they are doing, but to understand the very real reasons as to why they are based within these conflicts in the first place. Now, nevertheless, returning to my original point about religious sectarianism, of course, the Quran has mentioned in multiple verses, such as hold firmly to the rope of God and do not be divided. Unfortunately, many Muslims continue to hold enmity and hatred to one another for different theological views. And in many cases, these are theological minutiae, but even when they are fundamental disagreements, that doesn't necessarily justify this kind of mob mentality, this kind of inquisitionary culture. And the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, narrated from him that he said that the difference of opinion on my nation is a mercy, narrated by the likes of As-Suyuti in his Al-Jami' As-Saghir, although not necessarily authentic. Of course, many take this to be in the context Of course, many take that to be within the context of jurisprudential disagreements, but this can also be extended to those theological disagreements which minutiae, and they should not necessarily become points of major disagreement. And even those things which perhaps are major disagreements, but insofar as even if there are major disagreements, but they are within the fold of the Islamic faith. So long as they are within the Islamic faith, they are within the prophetic nation, then that is also a kind of form of mercy. And even if they do have positions which are unorthodox, which are deviant, but so long as they are within the prophetic nation, if they are misguided perhaps, even if they are, not correctly interpreting things, then that is still a kind of mercy in an indirect way. There are different narrations that may give the kind of sense of sectarianism. For example, the famous narration about the prophetic nation dividing into 73 or 72 sects. And of course, this is a quite famous narration that the Prophet Muhammad predicted that my nation shall divide into 72 or 73 sects, depending on the wording. Companions asked that who will be like the saved sect, who will be the one which will be guided. And the Prophet Muhammad said that what I am upon and what my companions are upon. And in other narrations, he mentioned the congregation of the Muslims. Now, of course, this narration, although the individual reports do seem to be weak, the number of shared narrations relating this kind of meaning, relating this kind of wording, seem to indicate that there is some basis for it, that there is some kind of authenticity for it. And scholars like Al-Baghdadi in his Al-Farq Bayn al-Firaq, so this is one of the main texts of heresiography and sectarian literature, detailing the different sects of the Muslim world. He mentions that a group of companions narrated this kind of narration, such as Anas ibn Malik, Abu Huraira, Abu Darda, Jabir ibn Abdullah, Abu Umama, and Wathila ibn al-Asqa. So basically a lot of different companions narrated this. So there does seem to be some kind of authentic basis for this narration. Many scholars, based on the wording of this narration, sought to set out to delineate or classify and categorize the exact 73 sects that are constituted within this narration. However, what's more correct to understand is that what this hadith is referring to is not a literal number, but many, many groups. Because the word 70, when it is used in the Arabic language, like 7, 70, 700, it is kind of like when you say the word dozen in English, it refers to a lot or many. And, the basis upon which the Prophet is saying 73 is to show that, according to the narrations, the Jews split into 71 sects. Basically, the Jews split into many sects, and the Christians split into 72 sects. So the Christians split into many, many sects, right? More than the Jews even. And my nation shall divide into 73 sects. So essentially what it's referring to is that the Muslims will have many, many disagreements. And perhaps these disagreements will be even more than the Christians and even more than what the Jews had. And that is essentially the meaning of this narration, that the nation of the Prophet Muhammad will divide into many, many groups. So it's not literally that there will be exactly 73 sects, but rather that there will be many, many divisions within the prophetic nation. However, regardless, a basic point to be raised here is that the general principles of tolerance, of freedom of speech or freedom of expression still remain as established within the Quran and the Sunnah. Thus, persecution of other groups is still prohibited on these grounds. And we have to make a basic distinction here between considering a view to be invalid and between considering something not worthy of being persecuted. In other words, just because you think that a viewpoint is invalid doesn't necessarily mean that you should persecute that view. And this is again just the standard, like, kind of classical liberal argument that a lot of classical liberals make, that just because you disagree with something doesn't give you the right to persecute it. And of course, the same holds true here insofar as we don't think that theological disputes and disagreements should necessitate persecution and religious violence. Of course, there have been critics of this hadith and there's been a back and forth regarding these narrations. Yet, nevertheless, the point here is that just because we think that certain viewpoints may be unorthodox or wrong does not mean that we want to persecute said people. There are many different narrations to demonstrate this and many different points that can be raised here. For example, it's narrated from the Prophet during the last sermon, during the last pilgrimage, that verily your blood and your wealth are made sacred upon you, like the sacredness of this day of yours, in this month of yours, in this land of yours. In another narration, beware, do not renegade as disbelievers after me by striking or cutting down the necks of one another. Hence, the Prophet was condemning here explicitly persecution, killing and oppression of other Muslims, and guaranteed the rights of Muslims under Islamic law, regardless of sectarian or denominational affiliations. Not just for Muslims, but also for non-Muslims or those who don't necessarily agree with Islam. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there's a statement attributed to him, although this may be apocryphal, but the principle is sound and has been used by jurists, that he who hurts a non-Muslim citizen of a Muslim state, I am his adversary, and I shall be his adversary on the day of judgment. And furthermore, we also see the basis for the state not being this tyrannical force, and the commonsensical understanding that you cannot go into the heart of a person and change his mind regarding something. Hence, this kind of forced conversion, forcing people to accept certain beliefs, is useless. And it is not the role of the state to force people to change their hearts and minds regarding something which they ultimately can't control. For example, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, as narrated in the authentic collection of Al-Muslim, that I have not been commanded to pierce through the hearts of people nor to split their bellies in sides. Hence, we are not obliged legally or on a religious basis to go into the hearts or minds of people and try to change or suppress their beliefs. It is not the responsibility of the state or any societal institution to do so. There's an interesting narration regarding the second caliph of Islam, Umar. We only judge now what is manifested outwardly of your deeds. Whoever shows us good, we will trust him and bring him close. It is not for us to judge anything of his inner secrets. God will hold him accountable for his inner secrets. And there are many, many narrations like this. There is the famous narration regarding the prohibition of spying, and that Umar attempted to spy on a certain group of people that he thought were doing something wrong. However, they critiqued him for that, and they pointed out that God said, do not spy and do not enter on people's homes without their permission. And on that basis, Umar left them alone. And this shows that the private lives of people and the freedom within those private lives is protected under Islamic law, and the state does not have the right to interfere as such. This applies in beliefs as well as in certain actions. Of course, there are going to be people who dispute this. There may be people of a more conservative or perhaps extremist, quote unquote, affiliation. And I hesitate to use the word extremist because I don't want to just label people here for different viewpoints. But let's just say conservative, right? Somebody who may be more conservative may have a different viewpoint as to what exactly Islamic law delineates. Others who are more critical of organized religion may think that religion in fact does give the right to the state to interfere in people's private lives, or it does allow for religious oppression, for example, quote unquote. Now, of course, these are different viewpoints and we can have this back and forth regarding it. But my point is simply to show the basis for freedom of conscience and for not interfering in the private lives of people within the Islamic tradition. Again, people can have these arguments about whether or not it does so, or whether or not different religious texts can facilitate said attitudes. But I am simply pointing out this perspective, which does perhaps give proof or precedence to the fact that indeed Islamic law can be used as a tool to support ideals of individualism and resisting state tyranny, properly operationalized within the context of a tradition. So we can see this basic individual liberty being intellectual rights protected under Islamic law. We see the issues with overly sectarian attitudes as well. In any case, we see that the Islamic tradition is incredibly vast and incredibly spacious, and it has historically had room for diverse opinions, different ways of thinking, and schools of thought. It is under the tradition progress, that change and reform can operate, and in fact, perhaps must operate even. For it's precisely the fact that many of these developments occur from the principles of said tradition. They don't just occur within a vacuum. The mistake the Enlightenment thinkers made was to view the above as incompatible with tradition and thus rejecting it as mere superstition. Many modernists, for example in the Muslim world, may also make the same mistake. On the other hand, fundamentalists and zealots may reject progress, reform, or change altogether as the antithesis of tradition. In reality, both of these views are wrong, for they stem from a misunderstanding of the nature of tradition. They both stem from the false principle that tradition is a static force that does not allow or facilitate progress, change, or reform. Both fundamentalists and those who reject tradition hold this view. However, one, as a consequence of this view, denies progress, reform, and change, whilst the other rejects tradition. Both groups' understanding of the relationship between tradition and progress is fundamentally wrong, for they fail to understand the true nature of tradition. Tradition, if understood as an institution spanning hundreds, if not thousands of years, can be understood as this kind of institution which allows for developments to occur within it. It allows for these kinds of organic developments, these kind of organic progress, organic reform, organic change. And this is borrowing from the kind of functionalist sociologist argument that societies are like organic beings, and hence they undergo organic change and organic development. And similarly, tradition, a societal tradition, a religious tradition, cultural, philosophical tradition, these are organic entities. And an interesting analogy to be made here is the YouTuber PF Young. In his video regarding archetypal memes, he mentions that what genes are to genetics, memes are to memetics. In other words, just like genes, or just like, biological entities undergo evolution, undergo change, so too do these ideals, these traditions, this kind of collective wisdom. It gradually evolves over time. It is built upon the generations and generations of thinkers who came before them, and it is constantly evolving. Of course, there are different kinds of traditions. There may be shared human traditions across time and place, and we may conceive of a broader human legacy where we can consider all the various intellectual developments of humanity. But then there are also the traditions which are specific to different peoples and different cultures. If tradition fundamentally stems from the individuals who participate in it, it's the product of the people who are part and parcel of it, of shaping it, and it is a heritage passed on from one generation to another, and it is a collation of the collective wisdom of individuals over hundreds, if not thousands of years, then surely the tradition itself must undergo change. It must develop and build upon its base in a process which takes place over generations. And so we can see that whilst the principles, the basis upon which a tradition is founded, those basic principles may remain the same, these principles may lead to subsequent developments and intellectual breakthroughs to occur, thus allowing for new reforms or changes to take place within the framework of the tradition. If one gets rid of this organic change, one essentially deprives the tradition of an extremely important function it has to play in society, which is the mistake that fundamentalists make. On the other hand, if one cuts off the very root and trunk, by abandoning the very tradition and its principles itself, one in fact compromises the basis for reform, the basis for progress, the basis for organic change, which is made by progressivists and many Enlightenment thinkers. Progress fundamentally stems from tradition, and tradition functions so as to facilitate progress. As progress does not exist in a vacuum, but rather within the context of tradition, it stems from it, it develops upon its basis, And tradition does not exist in isolation either, but rather it exists in tandem with and allowing for progress and being shaped by the evolutionary processes which it goes through on a more idealistic or abstract basis. This can also help explain the tension, which is in fact healthy for all societies, between conservatives and progressives. Conservatives seek to maintain the tradition and thereby maintain the law, stability, and order of society at large. On the other hand, progressives tend to seek reform, change, or progress, either by breaking away from or refining of the tradition. They may view tradition as fully, partially, or at least in certain aspects false and incorrect or mistaken. Yet it may be that in many cases the progressives' case for reform operates upon the principles given by tradition. For example, you will note that many of the different ideals that perhaps certain progressives may advance seem to be quite Christian in nature. They seem to be building upon this Christian basis, and whether they explicitly accept it or not, or whether they implicitly understand this or subconsciously understand this, many of these ideals are building upon certain Christian ideals, especially within a Western context. Or, for example, even in other contexts, they be developments upon a quite religious basis, for example, within the Islamic context, or even within India in the Hindu context. And even if that's not the case, then they are still responding to external developments. For example, many modernizers or many westernizers within different parts of the world are of course responding to introduction to the Western tradition, or the introduction to different Western political ideals or cultural ideals within these lands. You could say about certain progressive arguments, they may be taking these ideals in and of themselves, breaking it away from the tradition and taking them to their logical conclusion, or they may be realizing a truth about an aspect of those principles that others have not realized yet. An example may be the emphasis on individuality and individual rights within the Western tradition, like I mentioned. For example, the eventual abolishment of slavery in the West. Even if this aspect of the principle of individual liberty, of individual rights, was not fully realized in past eras, it was eventually so. And so gradually the collective conscience, it shifts to the acceptance of such ideals. It evolves to accept such ideals. This isn't necessarily a progressive argument because, progress and regress and conservative and progress, these are very much relative terms within the context of a society, the context of a specific era, specific tradition. Because what may be conservative in one society may be progressive in another. What may be quote unquote progressive in another society may in fact be conservative in another. So these are very relative terms. But the language or the terminology I would use is that the collective conscience shifts over time to accept different ideals or to accept different developments based upon certain principles. If we give this example of slavery, the abolishment of it, although not necessarily originally realized, was gradually a development upon certain principles within the Western tradition. For example, certain Christian ideals about the inherent value of the individual because he was made in God's image, or ideals of love, right? And it's interesting to note the divide between the Southerners who wanted to maintain the institution of slavery at the time, not necessarily for moral reasons, but more so for economic reasons, and the Northerners who did have a economic and, at a certain point they did develop a moral objection to slavery as well. And it's interesting to note that the anti-slavery side was also the one which was pro-union, meaning they were stemming from the American political project, whereas the Southerners, the Confederates, were pro-slavery, anti-union, and they believed that they were fighting on the basis of state rights, and they could be considered essentially a breakaway from the American political project. And so that's an important distinction to note, that the gradual development of the tradition, especially within the American context, led them to wanting to abolish slavery. Of course, there are different factors that go into play here. It was also a case of political expediency in the case of the Civil War, where Abraham Lincoln conveniently announced the Emancipation Proclamation exactly at a time which would have stopped the European powers from getting involved in the Civil War, for example. And so all those variables and nuances do have to be taken into account as well. But nevertheless, like I mentioned, within the Western tradition, there was a gradual development to abolishing slavery. And in the Islamic tradition as well, most contemporary Muslim scholars in fact, many of them, not necessarily most, but many of them have argued that the Islamic revelation and law laid down mechanisms and processes by which the institution of slavery would gradually be abolished. Of course, unfortunately, perhaps the Muslim world did not abide by these institutional mechanisms, but theoretically they were supposed to be put in place. Abdul Karim al-Mudarris, one of the great Islamic scholars of the last century, states that I firmly believe that if the Messenger, peace be upon him, had lived for 10 more years, little to no slavery would be left. See the book Anwar al-Qudsiyya. And one of the goals of the Islamic law was the protection of the honor, dignity, and life of fellow human beings. And the Quran praises the freeing of slaves. And what can make you know what is breaking through the difficult paths? It is the freeing of a slave. It is in fact tradition which gives us the basis through which humanity came to realize that slavery was an abhorrent institution. It was the developments within said traditions which led to this gradual realization, whether by emphasis on people's individuality and their individual rights, or the mechanisms and processes put in place to gradually phase out this institution and to stress the equality of all individuals before God. These are those realities that people have gradually realized over time, that have developed over time, even if our predecessors were unaware of them at one point or another. So what is to be taken from this whole rambling? The whole point is to show that tradition or traditions have principles within them that allow for developments, that allow for gradual organic change. Unfortunately, many of these traditions do stagnate, they do become static, they do become decadent. However, the developments within these traditions and the developments that do occur stem from the principles of these traditions. And when these traditions are in their very dynamic phase, when they have an element of dynamism to them, they do allow for intellectual developments, they do allow for intellectual progress. And in reality, many of the developments that we have had are on the basis of these principles, or on the basis of these traditional ideals. And so it's a complex, it's a nuanced discussion to be had. However, what I do seek to show is that whilst tradition can at times be used, or it can unfortunately become a kind of static force, in reality, traditional ideals, the principles underpinning any given tradition, can be used to allow for intellectual developments, to allow for intellectual progress, to allow for change and reform. And we can see this within the context of both the Western nations and the Islamic tradition. We can see how it allows for organic change and development. Indeed, it is in fact an endeavor encouraged by the Islamic religious tradition, as we constantly build upon the knowledge of the previous generations, whether in science, philosophy, or theology. To ignore this would be to ignore centuries of history. As such, there are constantly growing traditions, not static ones, not stagnant ones, insofar as the principles within these traditions can give rise to developments. And even if, unfortunately, these traditions do become static, practically speaking, they can still allow for developments to occur. And in fact, history is a witness to the fact generations upon generations have contributed to the development of philosophy, theology, of classical metaphysics, of different disciplines within various traditions. Currently, the Western tradition perhaps may be the one which is dynamic. However, it is important to know that other traditions have become dynamic, have reinvigorated this dynamic spirit within themselves, whether it be within the Indian context, whether it be within the post-Confucian East Asian context, or whether it be within the Islamic context. And these traditions, the principles within them, whether they be Western or non-Western, it is precisely the fact that the traditions, that the principles, that the ideals underpinning them allow for these developments to occur. And so we have to account for this complex and nuanced reality of tradition, that it can in fact allow for developments, that it can in fact allow for change, that it can in fact allow for intellectual breakthroughs to occur.